Next, we have John DiIulio. John is a political science professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he also was the first director of the White House Office on Faith-Based and Community Initiatives under President George W. Bush.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Michael Sean for inviting me, and it's been really enlightening and heartwarming to be in this group with you today. I have been teaching for 32 years at universities, taught at Harvard and Princeton, and the last 15 years at Penn. And so I like to say that I have learned the art of the Ivy League professor, which is to speak for 5 minutes or 2 hours on any subject with no essential change in content. So I'm going to give you the 5 to 10 minute version here, mercifully, with alcohol beckoning and one great call coming. The answer to the so what question, so far as I'm concerned, the core answer that I would give at least, is that the rise of libertarianism, what I'm going to refer to as radical libertarianism, but the rise of libertarianism over the last 15 to 20 to 30 years as an ideology has made it more and more difficult not only for governments, that is to say, not only for public agencies, including the one represented by that institution to my left outside the window, our Congress, our national government, but harder for government, harder for governments in general, federal, state, and local, but also harder for civil society institutions, including churches, to work either on their own or to work together in attacking what the Catechism refers to as sinful inequalities. That is, the essential so what question for me is answered by saying that it is more difficult today by both public-private and public-private means to address sinful inequalities in an efficacious, forthright way than it was in the era when libertarian ideas were less in the ascendant and radical libertarian ideas were considered an embarrassment that no self-respecting person would hold such ideas. Now, we've heard a lot today, many times, about the brief. It was a very brief address. I mean, there's only a couple pages in text that Pope Francis gave last month to a group of United Nations officials, I guess, from these humanitarian offices. And, you know, he did in that speech what I think popes are. It's okay for a pope to, cite the gospel. Gospel passage or two, Luke 19, 1 through 10, the rich tax man who made the Pope said, radical decision of sharing and justice because his conscience had been awakened by the gaze of Jesus. It's pretty good. But then he got himself, this is where the trouble came from, at least from all the folks we heard about who have attacked his speech, saying that equitable economic and social progress requires, quote, cooperation between the private sector and civil society. He said that. It's right there. It's in the same line. And, quote, the legitimate redistribution of economic benefits by the state, close quote. And that was the line that, caused the conflagration. So, and this was not only by conservative pundits, but let's, be clear, by self-professed Catholic conservative pundits as well, who basically charged the Pope, rather uncharitably, saying he's not a religious leader, but a white-robed politician peddling failed left-wing ideas. Huh? Well, I think the more just criticism of the Pope would be to say that, the Holy Father was being wholly unoriginal, because essentially he was just quoting other popes before him, including his two immediate predecessors, and, talking about how we have an obligation, all of us, not just Catholics, to battle sinful inequalities that are, quote, in open contradiction of the gospel, close quote. So what I want to suggest is that for a long time, Catholicism was quite successful, I think, and I think the story of the Catholic role in the labor movement, and I think also in trying to keep the labor movement strong in America, it's been a very, very hard struggle the last 25 or 30 years. The Catholicism was for a long time, both in America and around the world, pretty successful at, I'll just put it this way, mediating or modulating between two radical ideologies. One radical ideology, of course, was radical socialism, which I would describe as the ideological cult of the ostensibly all-competent and omnibenevolent state in which the human person has social and civic duties without having corresponding individual rights. Radical libertarianism, at the other extreme, is the ideological cult of the ostensibly self-created and autonomous individual in which the human person has individual rights without having corresponding social and civic duties. The former is bad. The latter is no better, in some ways arguably worse. And each of these cults, as we've heard over and over again today, is completely at odds with core Roman Catholic teachings. I just want to quickly highlight 4. I'm not going to, pretend to be a theologian and go into it all, although I do have my footnotes, if anybody asks. The common good, obviously, is at odds with radical libertarianism, the sum of all those conditions of social life which enable individuals, families, and organizations to achieve their complete and effective fulfillment. It's at odds with the Catholic conception of the political community as something that exists for the common good, that is its full justification and meaning, and the source of its specific right to exist. That's in the Catechism, so I think that's fairly clear. I already mentioned the concept of sinful inequalities, but I would say that I think it's very difficult when I see these sorts of criticisms that were made of Pope Francis and his address to the UN. People say, well, this is a radical innovation, new doctrine. Quote, the equal dignity of human persons requires the effort to reduce excessive social and economic inequalities. It gives urgency to the elimination of sinful inequalities, close quote. It's right there. Love for the poor. God blesses those who come to the aid of the poor, rebukes those who turn away from them. Love for the poor is incompatible with a moderate love of riches or their selfish use. And last but not least, subsidiarity, which my computer still does not. It gives you subsidiary, keeps correcting it. Opposed to all forms of collectivism, sets limits for state intervention. Neither the state nor any larger society should substitute itself for the initiative and responsibility of individuals and intermediate bodies. Yes, but also, the other piece of it, a community of a higher order, while it should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view to the common good. Am I shouting? Am I using my outside voice? I can hear my late mother saying, you're shouting in front of priests and bishops, no less, and cardinals. Radical libertarians demand their individual rights without having to shoulder any corresponding social or civic duties. They harbor no conception of the common good. The political community for them is but an unavoidable evil. They treat financial capital as sacred, and they expect the government to protect them and their real estate and other possessions if they themselves cannot protect them. But they are indifferent to human capital and hostile to labor rights. They acknowledge no sinful inequalities as such. They disfavor any government efforts to reduce sinful inequalities or manifest love for the poor. They are blind to the another self in others about which the Catechism speaks, and they reject any law that would require them by taxation or other means to contribute food, money, medicine, or shelter to dispossessed people. There but by the grace of God go I is not a sentiment that much stirs in their souls. They are as dogmatically allergic to government action, not least by the national government, as radical socialists are dogmatically addicted to it. Socialist extremists ignore the subsidiarity principle by embracing collectivism and relegating churches and other civil society institutions to a limbo of lesser civic significance. But libertarian extremists violate it no less by favoring limits on state intervention that delegitimate government's role in achieving the common good and render it unable to jointly support human needs that non-governmental bodies cannot effectively meet themselves. So they are okay with ministry, but they oppose a Medicaid. They value personal assistance, but they vilify public assistance. They deny that government at all levels can and should work in concert with non-governmental bodies to provide the conditions under which average people can enjoy peaceful and productive, if not uniformly prosperous lives. There's nowhere that I could find in any of church teachings, doctrines say we all have to have exactly the same income, we have to have exactly the same house, we have to, mow each other's lawns. It's not in there. But it's about the conditions that enable us to fulfill ourselves and about a consciousness of needing to take each other's existence seriously. I think you heard this as eloquently as it's possible to be said earlier today from the Cardinal. In short, whether at home or abroad, whether private means, communal exertions, or non-governmental assistance, if they fail, radical libertarians would leave orphans free to build their own orphanages, leave destitute homeless persons free to live on the streets, leave third world children suffering from river blindness to suffer it, and leave sick senior citizens with diseases that are curable if treated to die, free to die. Am I making myself clear? Yep. Now, let me be clear, in the spirit also of other things that were said today, that I think libertarianism as itself has much to offer. You may want to call it now modified as moderate libertarianism, sensible libertarianism, thinking libertarianism, pragmatic pluralistic libertarianism. There's a lot there because, of course, there are both principled and prudential reasons for doubting that governments, democratic and other, can predictably and reliably redistribute economic resources in ways that reduce or eliminate sinful inequalities and unacceptable human and financial costs. Governments don't always succeed in doing that. This government in this country has not succeeded in all cases in doing that. And so I think there are very important lessons to be learned from libertarianism. But there is, however, no reasonable basis for denying that global poverty problems and problems of poverty in the United States would be worse than they are were it not for the legitimate redistribution of economic benefits by the state, by governments, democratic and other, all across the globe. Over the last several decades, both within and beyond the family of democratic nations, government social welfare policies have helped to reduce sinful inequalities. The problem today, as I see it, the answer to the so what question, is that it is increasingly difficult for government, either on its own or in partnership with other institutions, to do just that. When I was in the White House, as the first director, as was mentioned, of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, now Neighborhood Partnerships, I think it's been really praised what President Obama has done in sustaining that office. I would meet with lots of people who said they supported faith-based initiatives. And then they would get in there and they would tell me about how government needs to get out of the way and how the churches need to do everything. And I would point out, little things, playing the social scientist or whatever, saying, well, if all the churches used all their resources, they couldn't cover a seventh of Medicaid. I'm not talking about just their charitable resources. I'm talking about they sell the organ, the buildings, they take out a second mortgage. There's just not enough there. But in partnership, they can leverage lots and lots of social good together. They wanted faith-based initiatives, many of those folks, but they wanted faith-based initiatives the way radical libertarians do it. Essentially, faith-based initiatives as in radical libertarianism and religious drag. Okay? That ain't going to cut it. And it's definitely not something that Catholic social teaching would allow. So I think the bottom line answer for me is what needs to happen, what now, is that Catholics need to take this seriously. Catholics need to wake up to it. Catholics need to be more vocal. And Catholics need to be less embarrassed and less apologetic about this piece of their Catholic identity. Thank you.